the circle of least confusion. However, I didn't really know the audience, so if we can go to the next slide. I changed it to, you've been scammed. How politics co-opted the Western Church's response to COVID-19 and is ultimately self-destructive. So you can consider those two titles until Nick gives me a thumbs up to continue. Okay, I'm starting at a quarter after. I assume I still have my same amount of time.
Yep.
And Nick, do I just need to say next slide to you, or do you think this works?
You can try that.
Okay, it does. I like to do what often in debates my opponents most don't want to do, which is to reveal with transparency where they're coming from. So I give consultative advice basically to every Western vaccine manufacturer vis-a-vis COVID vaccine. We've been funded for the development of a new peptide-based platform. All of those activities are transparently reviewed by the Mayo Clinic's Conflict of Interest Board and are in compliance with those. So the great task of decision-making, which is what I'm basically going to ask you to do this morning, right? The four speakers are going to relate information. You're going to take the information in. If you're starting to fall asleep, don't worry. My habit as a lecturer is I will move closer to you, which helps. My energy will pour into you. So how many of you are good decision makers? Everybody in the room's an adult. How many of you are good taking in data and making decisions? Nobody? Half of you? Really? All right, let's give it a roll and see. How many triangles in this picture? You just kind of yell out some numbers. Zero. 1. And any others? 8. Okay, so who said 0? You're right. There are no triangles there. At least triangles is defined by the usual mathematical understanding of it. All right, I'm going to tell you about Steve, healthy man in his mid-40s, lives in New York City. He's described as a quiet, meek, and tidy soul with a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. He enjoys reading and indoor activities. We'll just call these A, B, C, and D. Everybody must vote, otherwise I'll move towards you. How many of you say Steve is a car salesman? Nobody. How many say he is a farmer? Nobody. How many say he is a librarian? About 80% of the room. How many say a physician? Okay. Wait a minute. If you said a physician, keep your hand up. Good. Lord bless these people. The only logical answer here is that he is a physician. Everybody understand why? Okay, let's go back. This is the information I gave you. He says his name is Steve. He says he's a healthy man. He says he's in his mid-40s and he lives in New York City. Hard to tell nowadays, but we'll accept that as true. I then gave you babble. I told you nothing about it. So the only logical thing you could do, and remember, I'm giving you very little data with which to make a decision about, nothing like the complexity of the data we're about to get into and the topic we're about to talk about. So how many car salesmen are there in New York City? Turns out about 300, 350. How many farmers? None. How many librarians? Well over 500-ish, something like that. How many physicians? 10,000. So the only thing you could do would be to appeal to the base rate in order to make a decision, given that I gave you no real information other than the key piece, which is that he lives in New York City. But what I did, and you need to know this because people here are at the doctoral or pre-doctoral, postdoctoral level. Really, there's nobody more educated in the formal sense of it than the group gathered in this room. I gave you really very straightforward to minimal information, and I already knew. In fact, I predetermined your response that you would choose a librarian. I've done this with about 30,000 or so MDs and PhDs, and the proportion never varies, interestingly enough. whether I'm in Europe, in the US, or where in the US I am. So this is a representativeness heuristic. The cognitive bias that you hold told you this fits the stereotype of a librarian, and so you decided to solve the problem that you could do rather than the one I asked you to do. And that misled you into some degree of overconfidence. You were at least willing to vote in a public setting into your answer. All right. What about my scientific commitments? Let's make those transparent. I'm committed to the scientific method, recognizing that science in and of itself cannot make moral judgments. But saving lives and preventing disease is a sine qua non of being a physician, of medical practice, and I take it as a moral duty. I took an oath when I became a physician that science does best, as David was referring to, in transparent peer review and debate. I depend on that as a journal editor, in fact, and I'm committed to principled pluralism and what I've published as just vaccine policy. You'll see toward the end of the talk what those are. My theological commitments is I'm a reformed, just on the first rung of a pastor in the PCA church, going through ordination. Just graduated 2 weeks ago. So brothers and sisters, you can celebrate that even I got through at Westminster. So this is the second time in 2 weeks that we've flown to Pennsylvania. In that, I wrote a book and 2 theses. You don't have to do that for those of you that might consider Westminster. But one is Understanding Grace in Deuteronomy as the circle of least theological confusion. The second one is what you might be more interested in. I went back and read as much of the original literature. Jason and I were talking just a bit about this last night. Had to teach myself Old/Middle English in order to do it. And then wrote this thesis about a theology of fleeing and a duty of pastoral care. And the other things that you might expect in terms of how I feel about Scripture and my own subscription to the Westminster Standards. You'll see some of that in the talk too. All right, so Henry Van Til, the nephew of the Van Til, Cornelius Van Til, said this: culture is religion externalized. Culture is religion externalized. It's how we show on the outside what we believe on the inside. I'm right-handed and I have a habit of looking only to the right. I'm sorry. So think about this as we consider this debate, this great debate in Christendom about how the pandemic was handled. All right, now I tremble to present anything that looks physicky to physicists, so because I don't truly understand it, but I've used a model from ophthalmology called the circle of least confusion. And as I understand it takes light rays that come in through a focusing lens and then are coned down, shouldn't use the term cone when I'm talking about the retina, but coned down on the smallest possible circle that makes sense to our brains with the highest degree of resolution. And I found that an apt analogy to talk about things that sometimes are not just abundantly clear. Like I could say, the principle of gravity, every single one of you without doubt expect that if I drop this, I would have to pay for it because it would fall and shatter, right? Nobody questions that here under these conditions. But some of the things I'm going to talk about, you probably will question. So my thesis is this: the Western Church failed in its ecclesiastical mission in regards to scriptural imperatives in biblical cultural engagement by adopting unbiblical cultural and anthropocentric practices in response to the pandemic. Further, the church and many Christians basically failed in the cultural mandate, the idea of positively transforming culture and practicing things that would have saved lives. And as a result, as I'm sure you know, 1 out of 317 Americans who stood and looked forward into time, December of 2019, is now dead of the disease that we can prevent with a 25-cent mask and free vaccine. 1 out of every 317. All right, the past is prologue. Historically, and that's what's so shocking about this, brothers and sisters, is historically, the church offered hope and relief during times of epidemics and pandemics. In fact, I'm going to maybe push it a little farther than it should be, but there are historians, church historians, who would agree with what I'm about to say, is during the 300s and 400s AD, the church exploded as Christians visibly lived out values called for in Scripture and took care of the ill and vulnerable at wave after wave of the so-called Black Plague. In the 1500s, the Reformation, it is felt, was accelerated by the idea that these Protestant pastors and Christians were taking care of people, and they would die one after another, while the Catholic priests at that time, no disrespect to our Catholic brethren, but they would flee. They would flee the coming plague. And this had a huge effect on the expansion of Christendom during that time period. Martin Luther wrote, now try to imagine and translate the language and the science that they had at that time into modern day language as I read this. In the midst of the pandemic, that avoiding precautions, rejecting vaccines in an attempt to demonstrate faith, carelessness leading to the infection of others, and those who kept their illness a secret or passed it on to others were vicious and should be considered murderers. Strong language. He goes on to write in his letter to a pastor, Johann Hess, this: I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. That's in accordance with Scripture. I shall do the things I can to prevent infection. I will avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed. We call that distancing, in order not to become contaminated and infect or pollute others or cause their death. Those who have contracted the disease should keep away from others. After his recovery, should act toward others that no one becomes unnecessarily endangered on his account, and so cause another's death. Amazing words written back then. All right, William Cranshaw, a Reformed pastor that I studied a fair amount in the preparation of one of my theses, said this in the 1600s: abhor more than poison the wicked opinions that the pestilence is not infectious. Have we heard that in our society? This is made up, right? That each can do whatever he wants, that avoiding persons and places and diligent use of means for preservation are needless and of no use. I mean, change the wording to modern day language. Are you not reading what's in the popular media? All right, during the 1700s now in the US, for those of you that are more interested in it, I didn't put the reference, but I published a review in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2011, I think it is, called The Age-Old Struggle Against the Anti-Vaccinationists. And we go through all the vaccines since the beginning of the US. But during the 1700s, the plague, if you will, was monkey. Oh, did I say monkey? I meant smallpox. Most may not even know because of politics. WHO is reluctant to declare it. This is actually a monkeypox pandemic. It fits the formal scientific definition of a pandemic. So we have two black swan events occurring at the same time. Anyway, in the 1700s, the most vocal proponents, unlike today, were Puritan pastors. Reverend Cotton Mather's home was firebombed by the anti-vaccination with this little note on a brick thrown through his window. In the 1950s, I say that because I was born in the middle of the last century, It shocks me too. I thought it would take a lot longer to get old. U.S. churches endorsed polio vaccine and indeed became the places where mass immunization occurred, including to this speaker. I was delighted as a military dependent to find out this is a sugar cube. We got Sabin vaccine. And from the pulpit, this was urged on the population. How different from today. But since the 1990s, because of that, and Rick has been involved in some of this too, pandemic planning has deliberately included the input of the churches because it was recognized historically, basically the concept of positive cultural transformation and engagement, unlike what's happened today. So what's happened today, with maybe the exception of human papillomavirus vaccine, is completely aberrant in church history. This has not happened like this before. And in fact, I would say that the church's past involvement, recognized, by the way, I'm using the church in pretty broad brushstrokes, so this is not the audience to go denomination by denomination, because there are denominational differences, has been exemplary. All right, what happened? This pandemic occurred alongside an increasingly and highly politicalized and polarized political, economic, and sociologic trends, where as Christians, and there's threads of this we could tease out that I think we would all agree on, of a sense of persecution by the society that got flamed by media and others into not just the little spark we're wary of, but a roaring flame. And alongside this anti-authority and my own opinion, this is now opinion, I'll try to disclose where I think the science is and what's opinion. I think we are a pathologically narcissistic culture in general. We are very much a me rather than we culture. And there are cultures that are we cultures. Simplifying, but Asian cultures, for example, would more fit into that category than our own. So what happened? A growing mistrust of science and of public health, vocal anti-vaccine and science groups who really did peddle conspiratorial thinking, denialism, low cognitive complexity thinking, reasoning thought flaws, and this idea of the substitution of emotional anecdotes for data. One friend of my wife, Jean, there, and who has kept me fed and clothed through the pandemic. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had time. We had one friend who was telling me about his the electronic transmission of his Audi. He would not take vaccines. We'd have debates back and forth. And I said to him, finally, Don, what did the grocery clerk say you should do about your transmission? And he looks at me, he says, Doc, how would she know anything? And he stopped, and the light bulb went on for him. And I'm proud to say he's one of the rare persons that reevaluated, changed his mind, and took action. He died of a complication of the vaccine. No, I'm kidding. That's the thing you always fear, right? That 1 in a million is going to be the guy you worked on. Edwards said this: prejudices are rarely overcome by argument. This is something we have to remember, because not being rooted in reason, they cannot be destroyed by logic. This is the trap I personally continually fall into, that because of the way I've been professionalized, of course the data is the answer. Okay? It isn't. I learned it in spades with this pandemic, because what did we hear? Well, I'm not going to take a vaccine that is under EUA and not licensed. Oh, okay. But once it's licensed, what happens once it was licensed? Did we have this huge uptake in vaccine? No, we didn't. Some, but not what we expected, right? Not this exponential line. And then it was, well, only a few 100,000 people have been immunized. I'm going to wait until there's more. So there's something under 500 million total doses given in the US at this point. Has it changed anybody's mind with boosters? Not really, some, but not really. All right, here's the pandemic today. The most notable media visibility was regarding the church was of pastors who refused to comply with civil mandates and who often fed, I shouldn't say often, who fed mis and disinformation to their flocks and the public in order, and here's the underlying motivation from a small to medium-sized survey that I've done, in order to gain favor with their highly politicalized congregants. That is, they became man-centered and man-fearful, because if they leave, guess what happens to church budgets? Guess what happens to salaries and assistants? They go away. And they responded to that pressure, and they told me that directly. For those of you that read in Trust, it's a PCA publication. Timothy Franzen, who's a physician, wrote this. He was playing off the screw tape letters, which I thought was brilliant. He suggested a connection of such church and pulpit behaviors with what Screwtape called demonic instructionals, whereby antitrust and anti-authority trends led to undermining confidence, discredit facts, faith, and foundational beliefs. Beliefs spread confusion, polarize traditional support networks in order to divide and confound, distraction and misinformation overload, and create, exploit vulnerability, compel reaction, but never reason. All right, this is what I think and I've spent too much of my life in many ways with the anti-vaxxers. I don't engage them now. I will spend the rest of my life with the vaccine hesitant, those who actually want to understand. And here's what one person thought, and it resonated with me. The feeling in this highly politicalized environment was this: the coronavirus response was merely a dry run for even greater encroachments of government, surveillance, and control. There's the best lies have the grains of truth, don't they? Aren't we in the evangelical Christian movement generally conservative and generally fearful about the role of government or intrusion into our religious lives? And in the public square, there are elements, definable elements of that are happening, right? I mean, afterwards, when we're not broadcasting, I'll tell you an anecdote in regard to my own professional life. All right, Eliot said, when we do not know, or when we do not know enough, we tend to always to substitute emotions for thought. All right, so a proposed metric with which to think about this. Did the church and Christians demonstrate a willingness to, quote, disadvantage themselves in order to advantage the community in regard to the pandemic and mitigation measures? Did the church basically disadvantage itself for the benefit of the community? The community may not have thought of it as a benefit, but certainly we would, I hope, agree that saving lives is. All right, now into some of the coronavirus basic level of science. Let me be the first to acknowledge that everything we understand. So I have studied RNA respiratory viruses my entire professional life, going on 40 years, and have spent 12, 14 hours a day on coronavirus for 2.5 years. Everything we understand about SARS-CoV-2 is conditional upon time, which variant we're talking about, geography, host immunity, population structures and levels of immunity, community burdens of transmission, the interplay, and maybe the physicists will like this one especially. Welcome to the matrix. It's really hard to make decisions. The other thing I should say in there is it is very dynamic. So I came up with this title because it keeps us humble. Once you knew, and now you don't. Literally, what I know about SARS-CoV-2 changes in a day, 2, 3, something like some fundamental piece of information. So how can you ask the public to understand that? I've been so busy, I haven't kept track the last couple of weeks, but I've otherwise kept track. I'm somewhere just north of 3,500 national and international SARS-CoV-2 media interviews. And I spend more time with like talking with the media, trying to get them to understand. And their goal, for the physicians and others that do this too, their goal is to digest this into 100 words, a 15, 20-second soundbite. So it's not possible that the population would really understand. So what we know is wrong, outdated, tinged with false presuppositions, based on belief-dependent realism and tribalistic thinking. And yet, for me, the best method of knowing truth for a scientific issue is the scientific method, which is, how to say it, there's a certain instability in that over time, rightly so, right? Would we agree on that? That the science changes based on new ways of measuring things, new data, etc. The problem is that is often incompatible with what we want to believe. How many times, this is one, I don't know why this is the one I hear all the time. Well, they said eggs were fine to eat, and then they said, no, they're dangerous, you shouldn't eat them. Now they've come out and said you can eat one a day. They don't know what they're talking about. The next most common one I hear is about climate change, right? These scientists don't know. All right, what are some of the distorting factors? One is human behavior, as I mentioned. The false presupposition of the democratization of expertise has been a huge one during this pandemic. Everyone thinks they know, and nothing changes what they think they know. We have a false epistemology by which we often look at this, and as I mentioned, the cultural narcissism. So what's the brutal reality? As I mentioned, about 1 out of 317 Americans dead. We have more deaths than births in 3 out of 4 counties in the US. This is equivalent to taking 49 airplanes. One of our sons is a pilot, carrying about, I should say 4, it does say 400, but not here, crashing and killing everybody aboard for 52 weeks straight. So what would you think if a jet crashed? That's sad. What if another one crashed that day? What? What if a third one? What if 49 crashed? We wouldn't stand for it. Probably the whole airspace would be closed down until we got to the root of it, with this many people dying. Only more deaths, by the way, than due to the 1918 pandemic, where they knew nothing of this science. They didn't understand what viruses were. Only 71% of Americans over the age of 5 are fully vaccinated. Less than half have been fully vaccinated and boosted. So, we don't have half or more of America with us on this. And as a result, look at this wave after wave of cumulative deaths in the US. You would think with each wave we would learn, but it has been astonishing to me to watch this, even among a few physicians, I'm grieved to say, and a lot of nurses, where they'll say, well, that was that variant, we're over this now. When you go out in the world, what percent? Now you're at a university where they require it, but when you're out in the world, let me ask this. How many of you have gotten on an airplane since the mask mandate was lifted? What percent of people were wearing a mask? You and 5 other people, right? To America, the pandemic is over. And yet, with Omicron, we had more deaths in 4 months than we had with 6 months of Delta. They don't know. And it's no surprise. If you look at, this is some of the data, but if you look at the 21 countries that are our peers or so-called near peers economically, the US stands far and above any of them for deaths. Well, the physician philosopher Sandrel, French guy, said in 54, each civilization by its customs, its thoughts, its principles of thought, creates for itself a pathology appropriate to itself. A society chooses its diseases and shapes its pathological destiny. Boy, did he nail it, in my opinion. All right, SARS-CoV-2 variants and the lies we tell ourselves. So I will tell you that not a single vaccinologist or virologist that I know of thought that we would see something like Omicron. It was almost certain, because of what we knew, that what we would see would be further variants and subvariants of Delta. No one, not one, predicted Omicron. That's important to keep in mind. Now, why is that important? You see Delta and Omicron. Look at the number of mutations, particularly in the receptor binding domain. What RNA viruses that are highly mutable do, they always do this, is they mutate. There are some RNA viruses that are monotypic, like measles, for example. It does mutate, but not on the order of this. But partial immunity and unchecked replication is in of itself a mutational and recombinant pressure on the virus. And so this is predictably what's going to happen. And the predictable consequence of this is that generally it will learn to outmaneuver any pre-existing, or evade is the term you hear, evade pre-existing immunity, monoclonals, antivirals, whatever the therapeutic options are. And that's exactly what's happened. So this so-called, I don't like the term, but so-called stealth Omicron, BA2, is now basically was 100% of cases. Now what's happening is BA2 12.1, BA4, BA5, XE are all coming from South Africa and the UK, and now making up collectively about 15% or so of all the sequences. It outcompeted Omicron, about 50 to 60% more transmissible. So with BA2.12, we're at an R naught of about 12. The most transmissible thing we know about, other than fear, is measles, which has an R naught of about 15. Okay, so with every one of these waves, transmissibility has roughly increased about 50% each time. We are now down, by the way, to one monoclonal antibody that works. There's other, as I said, Omicron lineage subvariants. This changes so fast. I mean, I could sit down every day and adjust these numbers, but it gives you the rough idea. So if you look on the bottom, on the x-axis, estimated antibody effectiveness. As we move out, now we're at Omicron, BA4 and 5 are somewhere over here. The ability of that antibody, whether it's illness-induced, let's not talk about natural, it's illness-induced antibody or vaccine-induced antibody, becomes less and less effective. If this is Omicron, and we'll just round it to 1/40, it has a neutralizing ability, a 40th of what would otherwise be present against the ancestral strain. All right, some, I hope you like this, myth conceptions. All right, as a vaccinologist, what do we carry around as a construct? When you have a new epidemic or pandemic, certainly an immunologically naive population, nobody has, it does work now, nobody has immunity. And so what you want to do is build population level immunity up as quickly as possible. We were not allowed to do that by the American public. Okay? Those that do get vaccinated or infected, their immunity is surprisingly short-lived compared to other viruses. You could have measles, or I could give you measles vaccine when you're 1. assuming you're otherwise immunologically intact, when you're 90 and get exposed, you're still immune. That is not true with this virus. Now, there are, in fact, T cell and B cell memory cells that are developed that probably prevent the most severe spectrum of the disease, but not transmission. And so then you have to give a booster and rebuild immunity. You keep doing this until, with a hypermutable virus like this, you have to move to a variant-focused vaccine. So this summer, anybody's guess, Moderna's coming out with a Wuhan Omicron bivalent vaccine that looks to be pretty good in the less than a couple thousand people that they've used it in. Now, people, and I think it was because of the way the Pfizer headlines came out back then. Vaccine efficacy, 95%. And in the ignorance of the population, we can't expect them to be scientists, they assumed you're 95% protected against anything COVID. But that's not how it works. It is a gradient of protection. So it works very well in preventing death and even severe disease, but it works less well as you go down. And that's because for this vaccine, like nearly all of our vaccines, they are better, much better at disease blocking than infection blocking. For example, influenza vaccine is actually infection permissive. It doesn't prevent you from getting infected. It does to a small extent, but its value is in reducing complications due to influenza. All right, what about a second booster, since that's the big news now? This is based on 2 and only 2 points of data. So you're thinking by this time, well, okay, this guy's a vaccinologist, he's editor, of course he's going to be pro-vaccine. No, I'm going to look as dispassionately at the data as I can. So let me lift up the shade on the second dose, okay? So the situation we're in with Omicron, much less the subvariants, is that there's about a 20 to 40-fold reduction in the ability of neutralizing antibody to neutralize Omicron compared to the D614G variant, okay? So what does this mean? If you look at the risk of death, so 2 pieces of data, both of which come from Israel. Now, you could argue that their population's generalizable to ours at one level, not perfectly, that they gave a second dose to, okay? You see the numbers there. About 500,000, median age was 73, 60 to 100, and the second dose they got, in fact, all their doses were basically Pfizer. Death was reduced by 78%. Are you impressed? I hope what you're asking as a scientist is said, yeah, that's the relative reduction. Tell me the absolute. Okay, from 0.1% to 0.03%. Now, are you as impressed? Measurable, but fractional, right? And that held over the 6-week observational time period. That's all. What about, I guess I said that. Wait a minute, what happened here? Okay, look at the bottom there. Severe COVID, that risk was decreased by about 3.5-fold and did not wane over the 6-week observational time period. On the other hand, just looking at infection, the risk decreased about 2-fold, but it waned within 4 weeks, and by 8 weeks was back down to baseline. Now, I published this back in the early 90s with measles vaccine, that you could boost people and jack up their antibody level for 30 days, maybe 60 days in some, but it always falls down to your genetic set point. There's no leaving it up there. What we don't know as well, or don't understand as well, is B and T cell memory. All right, so the major issues are human behavior, and I'll just give you a quick preview of my own assessment. There will be another surge that once again we will not be capable of mitigating. Everybody I know that says they're careful, even other physicians, I'll go to a store, they don't have a mask on, they see me, and Gene will see them putting their mask on like this. They're not as careful as they think they are. Shaw said this: we learn from history that men never learn anything from history. That appears, I had hoped we were going to show Mr. Shaw wrong this go around, but we didn't. In fairness, my daughter pointed out he said men. All right, vaccine safety very quickly, and there's no such thing as safe, only safer. So you pick which risk you want: infection, vaccination, absolute isolation, the Howard Hughes approach that has its own risks, or some combination there. Those are the only choices you get. Whether you deliberately choose them by commission or omission, these are the outcomes. All right. So if we look at myocarditis, much in the news, let's look first at what happens in people who, these are observational studies, take that for what it is. But if you look broadly at the population, the risk of myocarditis is about 16-fold higher in people who develop, who are infected with COVID versus those that aren't. And it's different depending on the age group, just as we see with vaccine. If you look at excess events due to exposure per million, this is a nicely done study. What you see is that particularly the mRNA vaccines do in fact induce a certain level of myocarditis. But look at what infection does. So you could say to yourself, which risk do you want? Now you get to a certain age group, and it can well be that the incidence of myocarditis due to vaccine can exceed that of infection. And we can talk later about what does myocarditis mean. Pericarditis is almost, by contrast, almost all disease, as is cardiac arrhythmia. So let's balance the risks and benefits. That's the only thing an intelligent person can do. Okay, I get that there are risks and there are benefits, but how do they weigh out? So let's look at that just very briefly. Let's take the maybe the highest risk group, which is going to be these 18 to 24-year-old males. Okay, if I give give vaccine doses to 1 million kids that age, I'm going to prevent about 75,000. Now it would be more than that because of the variants. I would prevent about 1,000 hospitalizations, about 230 ICU admissions. The cost is 39 cases per million of myocarditis due to the vaccine. Which one do you want? There are no other choices. There may be with new vaccines, but right now there isn't. What about neurologic events? This is looking at 306 million observations, okay? And the bottom line is this: neurologic adverse events were between 100 and 600-fold lower with vaccine than with infection. In fact, you get COVID, your gray, the best study we have, it has its limitations, suggests your gray matter shrinks about 2 to 4%, i.e. the equivalent of about 10 to 20 years of aging on your brain. All right. So what we have now, a good friend of mine said, is a legion of small narratives that compete with each other rather than the grand meta-narrative of reason. Eventually, small narratives compete and grow into larger agendas that control. All right, what few fully understand is that the consequences of COVID-19, and if you truly understood this, I do not think you would ever be indoors with people who are not your family or well known to you without a mask on. One, increasing mutation and recombination events, development of detrimental strains that evade immunity. We cannot now eradicate SARS-CoV-2. It's in multiple animal reservoirs. So your great-great-grandchildren will be getting coronavirus vaccines. We blew it. We cannot get rid of this now. And significant follow-on pathology, whether it's mild infection or not. 20 to 25% develop symptoms of long COVID. I put this in quotes because we don't have a broadly accepted scientific definition of this yet. Significantly increased risk of over 20 different cardiovascular complications for the first year after infection. about a 40% relative increased risk of type 2 diabetes, 30 to 60% increased risk of a subsequent mental health diagnosis, 30% increased risk of an opioid use disorder if you were hospitalized for COVID. Other end organ damage, and as you may have seen in the media now, the maternal risks were known, but the risk to the baby was not really well characterized, and now there are risks. Okay, I'm going to fly through this part, but you know that the 5th, 6th, and Great Commandments are exceedingly clear in regard to love of and care of others. The New Testament, I provided just some for your interest, provides clear and well-known passages on obedience to the civil authorities and the laws. And given the high-risk nature of many church members, Ephesians 5:21 should have been operative, submitting to one another out of reverence to Christ. That did not happen. Where the church failed, in my mind, is gross violations of the 5th, 6th, and greatest commandments, failed in the scriptural imperatives, and at least for those that claim to be Reformed churches, they failed in adhering to the confessional standards and catechisms. I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to demonstrate to you, this is the Westminster Confession of Faith, saying that civil magistrates are appointed by God and are to be over the people. It is the duty of them to protect the person. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't fail in ample regards too, so that people not suffer. And we are not to offer any indignity, violence, abuse, or injury to any person whatsoever. It is the duty of the people to obey the civil authorities' rightful commands. Even unbelief does not make void the legal authority. Church authorities are to be obeyed too, unless it's counter to the Word of God. The larger catechism, here's 122, 124, 126, 127, 128. All of them speak clearly to the necessity of obedience to civil authorities. That is, surprisingly, in today's church, countercultural. Wars were fought and people died over the elucidation and general consensus and acceptance of these. So we have to understand afresh the indicative. That is what Christ did for us in order to motivate ourselves toward the imperative. That is what Christ demands of us. And we have to recapture what it means to be salt and light in the dark culture of Babylon. But how? Well, I think we could begin by appealing to at least a belief we generally share of being pro-life, which means in opposition to death. And we have to see death as a catastrophe, an obscene enemy, a poisoned arrow piercing the eye of creation, twisting history and nations, bereaving lovers, warping the constellations of community, of family, of flourishing. Instead, and we amply heard it in our church, this false mantra of no fear. Why do I have to fear if I'm in Christ? They're confusing two different spheres. So has the church, as Bill Edgar at Westminster argued, has the church confused the proximate for the ultimate? And I would argue it has. So 5 recommendations. 1, avoid dualism over a total worldview of Christianity. Scripture, if we profess belief, must, not should, must have a binding authority on our beliefs, and the solus Christus imperatives of Scripture must organize and direct our response with the radical principle of the antithesis in regard to consequential matters such as pandemics. Second, catechesis. A clear issue is that we are not catechizing in our churches anymore. Even in our PCA churches in Southwest Florida, we are not doing this. Without the background provided by that education, church members, I would propose, were vastly unprepared for how to think biblically and therefore rightly, and confused the spheres of the church and the sphere of the public square, of politics, of economics, etc. Keller makes the point of communal shallowness and says this: perhaps the heart of the problem is our communal thinness, the lack of distinctiveness in our own Christian communities. Isn't the church's real challenge today not only the views we hold, but also our failure to practice a distinctly different way of life? Why are we called Christians? That was not a badge of honor when it was invented. It was, if we use today's vernacular, those crazy Christians. Well, they're giving up their own life. They're selling their own possessions, and they give them to people who don't belong to this same church or whatever they call it. Radically different. So catechesis. We have to face the need to educate a church that is largely ignorant of the scriptures and largely ignorant of the controlling biblical images and metaphors that have really motivated us. We have to translate the redemptive historical message of the scriptures into the vernacular of the modern culture. In short, we have to look backward in order to go forward. In part, this is motivated by the cultural mandate. I'm not going to go through this. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this term, the cultural mandate and of cultural engagement. But we are basically commanded to have a positive, transformational approach to the world. The Jews actually have a word for it called tikkun olam, if anybody's familiar with that, to repair the world. All right, 3, this cultural mandate. The church must develop an explicit theology of positive culture transformation consistent with the cultural mandate. I put this in for Rick as a bioethicist, a strong word here, duty, meaning we have an imperative, given the indicative we profess, in how we engage the culture. And this has to be paired with a proper anthropology and epistemology, one in which there is an absolute truth held regardless, even to the point of, the meaning of take up your cross. It means basically take up the instrument upon which you will be persecuted and tortured and die. We can't bring ourselves to face the opposition of our fellow man. How are we ever going to pick up our cross and die? And this absolute truth has to be based on transcendent scriptural reference points. 4, and I can't spend a lot of time on this, subversive fulfillment. Now, this is Daniel Strange after another author, but this is really interesting to me, something I've only recently come to know and understand. But it's the idea that the gospel subverts the culture's message because it confronts the culture's story and the falsehood of idols. It fulfills in that it connects and coheres with general revelation, right? Romans 1. And the indwelt hopes and desires that God has placed in our hearts. Remember, we are homo adorans. We will worship something. Humans always have. And what we did this time is create a religion that remarkably and surprise fit perfectly with what we were comfortable with. And just one thing and then 5 and I'll stop. So here's maybe a definition. From the presupposition of an epistemologically authoritative biblical revelation, non-Christian religions or idols are sovereignly directed, that one may be challenging to you, variegated and dynamic, collective human idolatrous responses to divine revelations behind which stand deceiving demonic forces. Being antithetically against, yet parasitically dependent upon the truth of the Christian worldview, non-Christian religions are subversively fulfilled in the gospel of Christ. I know this is a water hose, but I'm just trying to expose you to some of this. So how do you do that? Just the 4 E's. You enter, you explore, looking for the elements of common grace. You expose the idols. That's what explanatory poverty is. These idols cannot hold up on their own. In fact, they must borrow the intellectual capital of the scientific method and of theology, and then evangelize. Oops, the 5th one is principled pluralism. You can look this up. I've published on it if you're interested. The basic idea that there's no neutral scientific or theologic ground. Individuals with different views must be respected, consistent with our beliefs. David actually exposed this as some of the basics of this society. Public health authorities have a responsibility, but there's a balance there. And the elements of just policy, you've heard of just war, of just policy must be central. And just policy has attributes associated with it, which I won't go through. If any of you write me, I'm happy to send you PDFs of these papers. Let's take a picture of it. Okay. So the meta-narrative is, the truth is that the rejection of masks and vaccines reflects an important cultural trend and transformation of our beliefs about what we owe one another. We have lost the scriptural idea of a collective common good, and instead now a profound paradigm shift has occurred so that we now discuss such issues using the culture's language of individual choice and freedom rather than that of communal responsibility. Why wouldn't we? How many of your churches have disco lights and stage smoke and all kinds of things trying to look like the culture? Guess what? Building a church of goats turns out to not work. The churches are meant for sheep, not goats. Well, judges nailed it, didn't they? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And as a result, I think the Western Church's response is self-defeating and self-destructive. And the bottom line why I say that is because, and I've heard people now articulate it, you don't look any different than the culture whose answers I know don't fulfill. Why would I come to you? You are no different than. And that is a charge we need to take seriously. The bottom line for Christians, I think D.A. Carson said it best, we must submit to being controlled simultaneously and all the time by all the teaching in Scripture. Isaiah, in a little different, but common elements here. They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. So with that, I will end. I took maybe a few minutes more than I should have. I apologize, but we have to leave room for the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so we're going to keep your mic there.
Okay.
We're going to try to do Q&A. We've been about 5 minutes over, so we have about 5 minutes left here.
Have at it, colleagues.
Not too crazy off our schedule. So we'll do this 2 ways. People in the audience here can ask questions, and then you should repeat the question so that people can hear it online. And then Nick will be our moderator for people online, and he will have the power to show them on the screen or to read their question if he sees fit to do that. So why don't we go ahead and you can call on your own.
Yes, sir.
In your data collection, have you controlled for the fact? I know of people that have gone in to be tested for COVID, and they signed up, and it was such a long wait. They left, and a week later they got notification that they tested positive. Do you control for that kind of situation? I've heard more stories than that.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by control.
They were tested positive for coronavirus, and they didn't take the test.
Right, but when you say controlled for it,
have you, in your gathering of the data, have you allowed for the fact that especially initially on, these reporting stations we're getting money for every COVID case, so they reported COVID when it wasn't COVID.
Ah, okay, I misunderstood your question. So the question is there nefarious behavior that is economically motivated by reporting positive tests that
That's
weren't
not what I
positive?
said. I said,
No?
do you
Okay.
control for that in your acquisition of the data?
You're using the word control differently than we would, but let me take a crack at it.
Okay.
So, no question that the ability to rapidly and effectively test such that it could be used for therapeutic reasons was faulty, was especially early on, very faulty. Now the problem we have is tests designed against the ancestral Wuhan strain are being used for variants. You know, to use an illustration, this is the virus that I built a vaccine against and the test against. Now I'm using it for this virus. They're that different in many ways. And so, and even better, worse, is that home testing rarely gets reported unless they happen to go in and get a PCR or something like that. So we don't have, the reported number of cases now is about 100,000 a day. Best estimates, vis-a-vis what you're talking about, is that number is 2 to 3-fold higher than that.
So you're saying that it's more likely that it's being underreported than overreported?
Yes. Yes.
Do you have a bucket in your data that says this many tests, positive tests for COVID, were found to be false?
So you're saying, what is the false negative rate?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
False
False positive, you're right.
Were reported
That
to be
is-
positive, but they weren't.
That is known for at one level or another for each assay, and to some degree for each variant.
How do they find
Okay,
it?
let's move on to somebody else.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'm done.
I have a question, totally different. So we talk a lot about this kind of duty to prevent death, right? But there's an inherent amount of risk in life, and everyone dies anyways, right? And so, like,
Life
I
is
don't
fatal.
have a firearm in my house because I look at the numbers and it's more likely to kill someone in your home than someone outside of your home, right? But I also get my kids in a death machine and drive them to church tomorrow morning that kills millions of people in this country, right? So as Christians,
Well. I think I know where you're going, but just to be clear, thousands, not millions.
maybe it's a global.
About 30,000 in the U.S.
But still, there's a non-zero risk of death occurring every time I get in the car. Life involves a multitude of risks. So how are we to tease out what risks we are willing to accept as Christians? Where does our love for the neighbor end in terms of the risks we are willing to accept, and where are the risks?
So using your analogy, and the question is, well, how do we balance risks and benefits? Using an automobile as an example. As a Christian, that doesn't mean we're perfect. You would, to protect neighbor, you have tires and brakes that work. You would not drive drunk. You would protect not only other people, but your family by wearing a seatbelt. You would, I don't want to be a hypocrite here, obey the speed limit and the stop sign. I mean, in other words, you would take steps to mitigate the risks for the greater benefit that you perceive the automobile to do. But let me just, when you read in Hebrews, work out your faith, you know what the actual original language says? Work out in the gymnasium your faith. In other words, it is a struggle. It is, Paul says he beats himself like an athlete would do, running the race of his faith. It gets at this point that I take well, that sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes there's not enough data. Sometimes the data that exists is misdata or dis-data, if there's such a thing. And so I can't give you a pearl other than to say, and I'm faulty at doing this, is to disadvantage yourself for the benefit, the love of neighbor, which is really hard. That is I am to some degree, I am a slave of the culture that I grew up in. And that culture, and just to expose it further, I grew up in a Marine Corps family, okay? So there was this tension between doing, okay? That's a big thing I had to learn in terms of Reformed theology, me doing and leading from the front. Honor, duty, commitment. And how do you balance all of that when, pretty sure, I am sure, I will take a life to save my own child's life. And I don't know if that's right. Oh, sorry. This is my habit again. I'm so sorry.
Thanks for all this, Greg. I'll definitely have to follow up on a lot of. I just focus on one narrow issue, the cultural mandate. So typically, the people who know what this is, have heard of it before, like maybe would look to Abraham Kuyper's stone lectures as the
and
kind of like
sphere sovereignty.
Right, all of that. So these are people who have a lot of the education quite often. Some of maybe the consciously, confessionally reformed church community. So we focus on this body of people who know some of this stuff, who have been catechized to a certain degree, and yet are still on the other side of some of the measures we're talking about. Those are the people I interact with most. The cultural mandate ends up in two directions, which make us wonder if it could ever be done. A culture war or culture Christianity. So one is this interminable conflict, the feminists, the Marxists, the you name it, whatever, okay? The Darwinists, I should add, I do a science thing. All these evil things that we must fight for the sake of the life of the church. So that's culture war. But the culture of Christianity, which is maybe a little more not lights and fog machines, but, we need to adopt.
That was just an illustration.
We need to adopt artistic modes or scientific modes of thought, to claim it all for Christ kind of stuff. And in fact, not critically engage with those things.
Yeah.
So cultural mandate tends to end up in these two directions. So to be more clearly specify cultural mandate, we don't end up in either place.
Yes, Jason, your question is superb. I mean, that's, yeah, so the question is basically, it's the type and anti-type issue in many ways. The tension in the cultural mandate from what we are supposed to do, right? We are fighting a battle. We are fighting a hard battle. And at the same time, and not ending up engaged in the world such that we become of the world rather than in the world. Do I have the gist of it? And
maybe another way to put it is, how much do we fight versus how much do we embrace?
Yeah.
And say there's good things that we should.
Oh yeah. If I came across as saying there's nothing in culture redeeming, don't leave the room thinking that. They're very, through common grace, look at what has happened in the sciences, in the arts, in music, in literature. Profoundly beautiful things that are not of Christ, other than they come from common grace. It is, the deeper you get into theology, and this is an example of it, you're always wrestling with this yes and I don't know of a clear way. In fact, I think what I can say is there is no answer or resolution to that until the New Jerusalem, when things are restored in their proper place. Everything is so sin-tinged that even our ability to accurately perceive what, in essence, your question in essence is a boundary question. Where is that boundary? What does that look like? And anybody else have an answer? I don't.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. So I'll take one here, and then we'll take one off the internet.
Oh, yes.
So just to slightly piggyback off that is the question of how to communicate to the lay audience or our Christian brothers and sisters or whoever, how much can we, in communicating science, the temptation is to just didactic, here's the data, or make it very understandable, or do we do what you kind of decried in the very beginning, which is substitution of emotional anecdotes for data, and yet that's how people are expecting to learn, and that's how they're swayed. So how much do we do that?
So this is a great, if I can try to distill try to distill the essence of that question. It's one of method. How best to engage with people. And I would say, again, we have a biblical example. The most powerful way of teaching and learning is story and parable. Our Lord used parable to effectively teach the most, if you will, educationally ignorant, I use that as a description, not as a charge, individuals. And I think we can do that. For example, Rick will be familiar with this, maybe others. The best way I have heard of explaining the need for human papillomavirus vaccine, which did ignite some controversy in the evangelical church, is this: HPV is sexually transmitted cancer. That grabbed a lot of attention, and I think transformed at least some of the discussions about why are we, quote, pushing this. The other part of your answer would be patiently, gently, slowly. I am not a good role model for that. I try to be. I'm not. And with love.
And the trouble with HPV is that I don't say sexually transmitted because no Christian parent thinks their precious child is ever going to have illicit sex. But it's a cancer vaccine. That's what I.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take one from the internet.
First, a quick comment in response to that question. David B. says, James K. Smith's book, Awaiting the King, is very instructive to the discussion about engaging a culture with balanced obedience. And then a question from Elliot Larson. Please comment on the Great Barrington Declaration. To me, there is a parallel between two approaches to COVID and general versus ring vaccination to control smallpox.
I don't see the two of those as well, and I'm no expert on the Great Barrington Declaration. For the most part, what I do understand, and there may be others here that know more about it than I do, these are not vaccinologists. They're not, for the most part, virologists. And what I have seen of it would require that you dispose of the scientific method in order to come to the conclusions that they did. That's perhaps the kindest way I could put it. Rick or others comment on it?
One of the, I think, parts of the Great Barrington.
You're coming up next anyway, so.
Yeah, Phil.
Just jump.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on Great Barrington either. The parts, and thanks, Elliot.
Tell the audience what it is. Yeah.
Thanks, Elliot Larson is an infectious disease physician and did some training at NIH and was a missionary. And the Great Barrington, I think, dealt a lot with the questions of the heaviness of the lockdown. So it's not so much on the vaccine, but on the issues of the lockdown and social distancing, and pointing out what about the social and other effects of the lockdown and was it needed, and that I think is an area of probably some debate. It's, I think, clear to me that masks do stop, and particularly high quality, well-fitting masks do stop viruses, that social distancing can make a difference, and that good air filtration can make a difference. Do we need as much lockdown as we had. Perhaps, at least in Pittsburgh, we have a big state, and what was happening in Philadelphia was not happening in Pittsburgh. And there certainly was some economic pain felt by a lockdown that was probably very important for the east part of the state, a big state, that not necessarily needed, but I think some more local control of those lockdowns would have allowed less economic deprivation and probably greater education of kids, greater social cohesiveness in Pittsburgh. We didn't need to lock down when Philadelphia locked down because we weren't having the happy here that they were. And so I think that's where I come with some of that.
Okay, let's thank Dr. Paul again.